Sanyal, whom Mr. Vivek Devroy fondly calls the 19th century Babu of Bengali Renaissance, vintage with an insatiable intellectual curiosity that can't be straight-jacketed and hemmed in with levels. Mr. Sanyal is principal economic advisor to Government of India, an environmentalist, and an author of great renown. He has authored books like Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline, Land of Seven Rivers, A Brief History of India's Geography, The Ocean of Churn, and his new fiction, The Life Over Two Beers. I now call upon our volunteer, Paru Sarin, to welcome him by presenting the moment. Thank you so much, Paru. We are extremely lucky to have you with us, sir. And now, I would request sir to take the dais and throw some light on this subject.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to see that there is a room full of people on a Saturday afternoon, so I will consider myself flattered. The topic I've been given to speak, I'll speak for about 40 minutes, which is as much, I think, people can tolerate a monologue. And the idea is to give you some flavor of one way of thinking about an Indian Renaissance. Since I know most of you are lawyers, so I will talk about it from the perspective of the importance of the rule of law in thinking about an Indian Renaissance. So when you think about an Indian Renaissance, and incidentally it is the title of my very first book written when I was in my 30s, more than a decade ago, and there I talked about the rise of India after 1,000 years of decline. But I'm going to take you a long way further back, many thousand years, in order to give you a flavor of how Indians thought about the nature of the state, and particularly about the rule of law. I think this is important to think about as I will show you in the present context. Now when one says a renaissance, the word literally means a rebirth. So since it is a rebirth, it must mean that at some point we are aspiring to be something that we had hopefully had some semblance of in the past. So in that sense, while it doesn't have to be an exact replica, nevertheless there is a sense that there was something that was there in the distant past that we can aspire to. And I think in this context, it would be interesting to look at how our ancient forebears thought about the role of the state and the rule of law, as I mentioned. And I'm going to do this particularly because very few of our textbooks, whether it is in high school or in college, talks about our own intellectual traditions. Now, of course, India has a long intellectual tradition of thinking about many things from spiritual and religious philosophy, mathematics and so on. But we also have a very long history of thinking about political philosophy and economic philosophy. And of course, one of the most famous books written in this was, of course, Kautilya's Arthashastra. But long before Kautilya's Arthashastra, there are already in the epics many hints at how Indian thinkers had thought about it. Now, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the epics, most of you will be generally familiar with, can be thought in multiple ways. You can think of it as simply two culturally very important stories. You can think of it in religious terms. You can even think of them as being perhaps somewhere in there a kernel of a historical truth, which may have layer on layer of other things laid on it, but maybe there was actually a major war in Kurukshetra, and somewhere in there that story is hidden. I'm not here to talk about that. Instead, I'm going to show you how the Ramayana and the Mahabharata can also be thought of as a debate about how to think about justice. Now the Ramayana, which is considered the older of the two epics, starts out very early on as a story of love and adventure. The original story, and at least I believe that the very original story may in fact have predated Valmiki. And Valmiki, although in later tradition, shows up as being a contemporary of Ram and Sita, particularly in the last part of the story. It hints that he was a contemporary. But it is widely known that the Uttarakhand is actually a much later edition. By most reckoning, Valmiki was actually retelling a story that was already in existence. And this story was a simple story of love and adventure from what I can make out to be. It was perhaps quite similar to what the average Indian grandmother tells her grandkids. It was a simple story. But over time, it layer on layer added various meanings. And one of the things that by the time Valmiki began to put it together, and perhaps we don't quite know which bit is Valmiki's and which bit is later addition, but at some point in time, it became about the rule of law and about keeping promises. And you see that tradition very much echoed in later times by the time Tulsi writes the Ramayana. So it becomes prana jayi par bachan na jayi. It's about keeping promises. It's about enforcement of contracts, something that you all think about. So now think about the Ramayana in a different way. Throughout the story, what is going on? Ram is finding himself in situations where he has to essentially follow the rules or keep a contract or a promise, very often when it is entirely unfair. So his father has given a promise which leads to his being sent to exile. Everybody agrees it's unfair. Even the beneficiary of it, Bharat, agrees it's unfair and begs him to come back. But Ram sticks to the rule of law in a very strict kind of way, and he follows whatever is whatever the contract is, he follows it. The same thing happens in the very end as well. Ram does not justify the fact that Sita has to be sent away. He knows it is entirely unfair. He pines for her. He never marries again. In fact, one of the strange things about the Ramayana is that it is deliberately changed to make this point, i.e. an entire new section, the Uttarakhand, is added in the end to make the story much more about the rule of law, that law has to be followed even if it is unfair. That is the point, that is one way of thinking about the entire Ramayana, and making a case for essentially that the rule or a promise has to be kept. And you see that, as I mentioned, with Tulsi's term, prana jayi par bachan na jayi. But that is not the end of the story. The Mahabharata comes along, and in the Mahabharata, the following of the rules always by and large leads to not very happy outcomes. So, the custom of the time is that if you are invited to play dice, you have to, it was Kshatriya Dharma that you had to go there. The Pandavas perhaps guess that they are being tricked, but they continue to play. And having played, they keep putting things on bets and keep losing. Of course, they lose their kingdom, and very infamously, of course, lose their common wife, Draupadi. Draupadi is brought to the court. Legally speaking, she is now owned by the Kauravas. They are now, by the laws of that time, allowed to do whatever they wish. And so they decide to disrobe her, to insult her. Now, this is the context in which Krishna turns up. Now, note that he does not violate the law itself, the text of the law, but he does violate the spirit of the law, because he turns her sari into something infinite. Why is he doing this? Because in there is a conception of natural justice. That there's somehow something wrong about following the text of the law. Remember, in Ramayana, natural justice is almost being suppressed. It is all, everybody agrees many of the things done are unfair, but the rule says that it has to be done, so it has to be done. Krishna does not in any way violate the law itself, but he does have a conception of what is natural justice, something I'm sure you read about a lot. And so what he does, he twists the law deliberately in order to continue a certain sense of natural justice to be played out. The same thing happens after the killing of Abhimanyu. Arjuna says that before sunrise I am going to kill the man who was responsible for my son's death. I think his name was Jayadratha, if I am not mistaken. Now, many of you know the story. Jayadratha is somehow protected by the Kauravas. So Krishna makes it such that it is a very cloudy day and it looks like it is already sunset, and Arjuna has failed to kill Jayadratha. So he prepares to commit suicide by entering his own funeral pyre. And just as he is about to do that, the clouds part, the sun comes out, and Jayadratha, who had of course come there out of curiosity to see this event, is standing there, and Arjuna picks up his bow and shoots him and kills him. Again, Krishna has not violated the law technically, but he also has allowed a certain sense of natural justice to override the law. Now, why am I telling you this? Because it is not that the Ramayana and Mahabharata resolved this debate between the text of the law and a sense of natural justice. I'm just giving you a sense of the fact that even in ancient times, many of the things that we grapple with today were critical parts of our philosophical tradition. And they were debating it then. And it was a debate, interestingly, between the view of Ram and the view of Krishna. And interestingly, of course, the ancients understood that they were two sides of the same coin. But of course, Ram and Krishna are avatars of the same God. Now, many centuries after this, during the Mauryan period, we begin to see many of these ideas begin to come together. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these ideas come together in a book called the Arthashastra, written by Vishnugupta Kautilya, somebody who is also known as Chanakya. He was, of course, one of the founders of the Mauryan Empire. But it is quite interesting when he writes his book, he clearly is not writing in a vacuum. He had been before that a professor in the University of Takshashila, and he had studied under many great scholars, and in the Arthashastra he mentions many of these other scholars. But that there are two big schools of thought that he begins to give a sense of, and there were two schools of Brihaspati and Ushanas or Shukra. Now it is interesting because Brihaspati was the guru of the Devas and Shukra was the guru of the Asuras. Now today we tend to think of them as one bunch as good guys and the other bunch as bad guys. But in Vedic tradition, well into clearly, at least into Mauryan times, it was not the case. They were just seen as light. They were seen as two forms of deities. And in fact, in the Rig Veda, they are both worshipped. Rudra, for example, is called a Asura. Varuna is an Asura. So here you have the beginning of the Arthashastra, and in the Arthashastra, basically, it starts by saying salutation to Brihaspati and salutations to Shukra. So what were these two schools of thought? Now it is quite interesting that these two schools of thought led to two somewhat different views of how policy and administration need to be done. The school of Shukra was all about Dandaniti. So why Dandaniti? Basically, again, a strict adherence to rule of law. That was what the school of Shukra was. Those were called Asuric view of the world. And then there was the Brihaspati. They were those of that school were interested in policy. So what the Arthashastra is doing is saying that there are these two views of the world, and it then tries to combine them in multiple ways. Now, so by combining them, what are they attempting to do? What is it that the state is supposed to be achieving? And in this, the Arthashastra is very clear. The central role of a state, of the state, is to avoid Matsya Nyaya. So what is Matsya Nyaya? The law of the fish, where the big fish eat the small fish. Now this is a foundational idea of Indian political and economic thought, that the role of the state is to stop the large fish from eating the small fish. And therefore all this paraphernalia of policy, of justice and so on is very, very important. And so therefore Kautilya envisages the ideal state as not a welfare state, but as a state that essentially stops Matsya Nyaya. So it is a limited state, it is a strong state, but it is a limited state. So Kautilya is not a libertarian in any stretch of the imagination, but he has a very limited view of what the state should be doing. What should the state be doing? Well, to avoid Matsya Nyaya, it should at least have protect itself from external enemies. It should also have monopoly over violence in its own territory. That's important. So there's a lot of emphasis on internal and external protection. It should provide some basic infrastructure, but very importantly, it must provide justice. And so the Arthashastra clearly mentions that Dandaniti is the essence of good governance. It mentions this very, very repeatedly. But he also goes on then to clearly mention that the state, he mentions, of course he doesn't use the word state, he calls the king, but he uses the king not as necessarily as a person, but as the institution. The king, i.e. the state, must always be restrained. And you see that repeatedly over and over again. The state must be always restrained, hold back, limited. You see that also coming through in Kamandak, who was a later philosopher and a follower in the Gupta period of Kautilya. So why are they so interested in limiting the state? Now, in the Western thinking, and many of you will have been exposed to that, because that's how most of our education has been set up. Limiting the powers of the state is largely done on grounds of freedom. So the Magna Carta, which is the origin of current Western thinking, is about limiting the power of the king vis-a-vis his nobles. Then you have Locke and Hobbes and others. And wherever you go in that, you see Enlightenment ideas of the late 18th century, early 19th century. The state is limited and on grounds of individual rights, the rights of man. So this is the reason, the context, of course, in that time was the absolute king. In the context of the French Revolution, there was a revolution against the king. In the context of the American Revolution, again against the king, the British king in that case. So there they were trying to limit the king against the excessive powers of the king. So it is about freedom and liberty, that is why the state is limited. Now, the Arthashastra, however, makes a very different and very Indian reason for limiting the state. It is corruption. Basically, Kautilya says, just like it is impossible to tell when a fish is drinking water because it's swimming around in the water. In the same way, it is impossible to tell when a government official is skimming government funds. In other words, he says that government officials are inherently corrupt, i.e. the starting assumption of every administration, every state architecture is not that the citizens are corrupt, but that the government official is corrupt. Now that is the context and why, because remember, they had created the Mauryan Empire on the ashes of the Nanda Empire. And the Nanda Empire had fallen apart due to excesses of corruption. So they were replacing in their context. So in our context, it was that the state has to be limited, not because necessarily of the rights of man, but because the government official is inherently corrupt. As I said, it's a very Indian way of thinking about the same problem. They are two sides of the same coin. However, just like there was a debate between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Mauryans also had a debate. So 3 generations later, or 2 generations later, you have an emperor rising called Ashoka. Now Ashoka, incidentally, quite contrary to the popular legend about him, Ashoka was not in Indian tradition at least seen as a good king. There's more than adequate evidence to show that he usurped the throne, murdered his entire family, and then he invaded Kalinga and carried out a massacre, which he of course himself agrees to. But then this whole story of him becoming a Buddhist and becoming a pacifist is essentially a 20th century invention. There is no evidence of this. All the evidence suggests that he was already a Buddhist by the time he invaded Kalinga. And there is also no evidence to suggest that after invading Kalinga, although he does suggest some regret, that he became a pacifist, because there is more than adequate evidence that he carried out many massacres afterwards as well in Bengal, particularly against the Jains and a cult called the Ajivikas. So this whole story of him becoming a wonderful pacifist is actually completely made up. I've written a book about it, so you can Google up some articles I've written about it. But that is beside the point. I am here talking not about what he did, but what the philosophical context was. What Ashoka says is very interesting in his edicts. Ashoka says, I am the father to my people. It's a very paternalistic view of what the state is. The state is the Mai-Baap, literally. And he in fact says so. He says, just like a mother hands over a child to a nurse, I have handed over my people to my officials. Now notice how different it is in conception to Chanakya's view to the Ashokan view of what officials are to do. Then he says, I am going to now institute a special class of officials called the Dharma Mahamantas. Now if Chanakya had been alive, he would have been horrified because he thought of it as religious police. I mean, that's what literally Dharma Mahamantas translates to, incidentally. But Ashoka then institutes a whole bunch of very intrusive kinds of laws. She says, on the 3rd day of Tissa and the 4th day of Chaturmasi, you will not eat fish. On so and so day, you will not castrate bulls. Like seriously, the bull cared which day he got castrated. So this is a very different conception of the state. A state who is essentially a Mai-Baap Sarkar. Now, in 1947 we become independent. Guess who we conceive as being the leading thing? So who did Nehru and the early leaders of this country think of being the ideal? It was Ashoka. And so you see, many of Ashoka's not so positive things are quietly brushed under the carpet. None of your textbooks will tell you about it. And he is then converted into this Ashoka the Great. Now, nothing in Indian tradition suggests that Ashoka is a great. In fact, he was reviled so much that he had been largely forgotten in the 19th century and was only rediscovered by British. So there's nothing in the Indian tradition to suggest that he was considered a great king. In the Indian tradition, his grandfather Chandragupta is considered a great king. So what happens here is Ashoka is instituted as the great king, and therefore why? The reason this is done is because of how Nehru conceived of the state as well. He conceived of a Mai Baap Sarkar, and so we ended up consequently with a all-pervasive but weak state, compared to Chanakya's visioning of a strong but limited state. So the state we have true, this is no longer as bad as it used to be before 1991, and we have begun to unwind it. But even today, the default option of our thinking, of what is contained in your textbooks, of even much of political debate, is the default option is essentially an Ashokan. And this is a real problem, because whenever as a policy maker I find a problem that we face, the default option of the bureaucracy or even general public is to opt for a very statist solution to that problem. Why? Because we have imbibed the Ashokan idea to such an extent that we do not even know that there is an alternative way of thinking about it, and not only in the Western view of libertarianism and so on, but in our own tradition of thinking about it. So what I have come here to try and do is to, one, open your eyes to the fact that there is another way of thinking about this whole thing, but also to say that this is not some theoretical thing that I am just letting out. This is important because the legal system now poses perhaps the single biggest challenge to the rebirth of India. Now, all of you know that Prime Minister Modi has given us this target of a $5 trillion economy in 6 years' time. This will make us the world's third largest economy, at par with Japan. So it's not a trivial thing that we are attempting to do. And the biggest constraint to being able to achieve this target, in able to trigger the virtuous cycle of investment and growth, turns out to be, oddly enough, the inability to enforce contracts on time. So, in the last 4 or 5 years, as many of you may have read in the newspapers, our ranking, global ranking in the ease of doing business, which the World Bank sets out every year, has gone up from somewhere in the range of 140 out of 190 to 77. Now still, 77 is nothing to write home about. It's still a pretty poor ranking. Still, it's a dramatic improvement on what it used to be just a few years ago. But sadly, there is one subcategory where we are still 163. And that is in the category for enforcement of contracts and dispute resolution. 163 out of 190 countries. All the countries below us are essentially at war or are fundamentally dysfunctional countries like Somalia and Yemen or something like that. So we are literally the bottom of the heap. Now we have to do something about this, because without it we cannot aspire for a renaissance. With 35 million cases, this is an economic problem, it is a social problem, and it is a genuine breakdown of one of the core things that the Indian state is supposed to do. And in fact, as a policy maker, let me tell you, whenever we make a policy, we have to jump through so many hoops, make so many complicated sub-laws, simply to try and avoid getting in any way entangled with the legal system. In fact, I can tell you my own personal experience. I have been very much involved in operationalizing the insolvency and bankruptcy code, and I'm sorry to say, the inability of the legal system to be able to comply with some very basic principle laid out clearly has meant that we have had so many times seen things getting stuck in the pipeline, all kinds of rules and sub-rules having to be changed by the government in order to keep this thing rolling